Hi all, in this video I'm going to begin to sketch out Plato's divided line. Again, in the text Palmer refers to this as the simile of the line. Fair warning, it's fairly complex, it's initially confusing, it'll take a couple of videos for it to sink in. So in this video I'm going to really focus in on the bottom half of the divided line. So at the top here I'm picking up exactly where we left off in the previous video. In the previous video, we laid out three objectives. The first was simply to define our terms. What do you mean by knowledge? What do you mean by opinion? And we accomplished as much. There again are the four defining characteristics. If you become confused, you might want to reference this list here. And again, the third defining characteristic is the key. So I'll leave that at the top if we need to refer back to it. But really this again just gives us an abstract theoretical definition. Just because we can define a particular thing doesn't mean that there is such a thing. We could, as an example, maybe agree on the definition of a unicorn, but having agreed on the definition of a unicorn, it doesn't mean that unicorns actually exist. So we've got an abstract theoretical definition, and now we want to see if anything actually fits that definition. So let me start here by posing what seems to be a simple, straightforward question. Can we come to have knowledge about what Plato refers to as sensible objects? And I want to pose that as a question. Can we come to know sensible objects? Would sensible objects fit this definition that we've sketched out here? And by sensible object, if that's kind of an antiquated term, what does he mean by sensible object? I just mean a physical object, the sort of thing that we could quote-unquote come to know by way of sensing, thus the name sensible object, the sort of thing that we could see or potentially reach out and touch with our own two hands. And I think for many, this number one is kind of a silly question. What do you mean, can you come to know sensible objects? But even if we were seriously posing that question, as I am apparently doing right now, it seems to be number two, a question that we can easily answer. I think for everybody, number one, silly question, but number two, easily answered. Of course we can come to know sensible objects. We know them by sensing. The senses give us knowledge. We learn about the world by observing, by experiencing, by seeing, by collecting data, so on and so forth. But this, if you will, is the first sort of odd twist along the way. And it's the first of many. Remember, I gave you a warning at the beginning. For Plato, sensible objects are not the objects of knowledge, they're the objects of mere opinion. So this is his conclusion. It seems like a head-scratcher initially, maybe it's out there kinda in left field. What we need to do now is backtrack and sketch in the premises. How did he arrive at this conclusion? The conclusion again being that sensible objects, physical objects, are not the objects of knowledge, but are the objects of mere opinion. So let's return to where we started. And again, as I've mentioned a couple times, this is the key. What Plato is saying here, essentially, is that sensible objects are not the sorts of objects that endure, which would be indicative of knowledge, but rather are constantly changing. So this is the opening move, and as I start to sketch out the divided line, this will belong on the bottom half. So as you can tell already, I like to sketch out the divided line and into top and bottom. So we're going to start at the bottom, that'll be the focus of this video, and then we'll worry about the top as we sort of make our ascent towards wisdom in a separate video. So move number one is that sensible objects are constantly changing. And here, this too might seem like a bit of a head scratcher, so let me explain this in a little bit more detail, and then we can get to the second key premise of his argument to support this conclusion. Opinion, not knowledge. Not yet. So as an example, what about this desk? This desk seems like one permanent, unchanging entity. It's here in my office. I see it every day. It's been here for years. And in fact, it will presumably be here long after I retire. What do you mean that this desk a solid, permanent, massive entity is constantly changing. But notice here that this is a very human perspective on time, very human take on objects. What if we were to really stretch out this time scale? Now that's correct, that this desk was here before I came to Palmer Martin. It will, I'm sure, be here after I retire and leave Palmer Martin. But from one day to the next, from one quarter to the next, from 1 year to the next, there doesn't seem to be any change of note. But what if you stretch this out and talk not in terms of days or weeks or even quarters or maybe even years, but what if we stretch it out and talk in terms of centuries? If somehow or another I were able to come back to this exact office 100 years from the present, would this desk have endured for an entire century? And I'm sure it's fairly well made. It seems solid, but ultimately I suspect this is a plasticky veneer. There's probably particle board underneath. It will serve its purpose for an extended period of time, but I doubt very much that it will last 100 years. Eventually this thing will fall apart. It'll break down, they'll take it to the dump, and it will cease to exist as a desk altogether. What if we stretch it out, forget hundreds of years? I mean, that's about as good as it gets for a human lifetime. What if we stretch it out to not centuries, but thousands of years, or millions of years, or trillions of years? Now, I think you would agree on this point. Nothing in the sensory, visible, physical world will endure for trillions of years. You know the answer already. Even the sun one day will burn out. The universe will suffer a cold death. Forget about this desk. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I mean, that's true for all of us, right? Physical objects are constantly changing as time marches on. And now we get to the second premise of the argument. If that's correct, all sensible physical things, including you, including me, are constantly changing, then premise number two, how can you know that which is constantly changing? So here's the argument. Let me switch slides. This is pretty high tech. I know you're impressed. But here's the argument laid out formally. Premise one, sensible objects are constantly changing. If we consider an extended time scale, that seems to be objectively true, I think. So I'll go ahead and assume that you're on board with me. How could you disagree? Premise one is true. And then there's that second premise. One cannot know that which constantly changes. If a particular object is different each and every moment, then how could you come to know it? And I suppose there's room for a little pushback here on premise two. Maybe you want to reason as follows. Fine, Plato, I see where you're going, but isn't it true that I can know an object at a particular moment in time? And I think that's fair, but Plato, of course, has a ready-made response. Time is fleeting. Time marches on. The moment is up. And so the object will have changed, requiring that you come to know it again. And then, well, the moment is up, the object has changed, and you would have to come to know it again. How can you gain any epistemic traction in a world of constant change? How can you come to know something that's different each and every moment? Doesn't premise two ring true as well? And if you're on board to this point, then the conclusion follows necessarily. That is, the conclusion must be true. Notice that this argument is deductive, meaning that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It is deductively valid, that is. And I think the premises are true, aren't they? Sensible objects are, in fact, constantly changing. How could you know something that's different each and every moment? In the grand scheme of things, how could you know something that's constantly changing? Therefore, you can't know a sensible object. So there's the opening move. The conclusion seems fishy initially. What do you mean you can't know sensible objects? Well, there is the argument laid out formally. It's deductively valid. It looks like the premises are true. And so here's the term for this. That would make the argument sound. Number one, it's valid. Number two, it has all true premises. Now, if you'd like to entertain an objection to either premise one or premise two, shoot me an email. I'd be really interested in hearing your objection to either premise 1 or premise 2. If you can't object, then there is the conclusion. Again, it follows necessarily. Now back to the divided line, again focusing on the bottom half. Our big picture objective was to establish that knowledge is not just definable, there's our definition, but it's actually obtainable. And notice here, this would be a giant step backwards. Rather than discussing the sorts of things we can know, we're moving in the opposite direction. Let's wipe the slate clean, let's tear it down. Sometimes to open yourself up to the possibility of learning new material, you have to take a step back, open your mind, and realize that maybe you don't know so much after all. So rather than accomplishing the goal, again, we're going backwards, it seems. But in going backwards, we're wiping the slate clean and making some progress here. While we're at it, let's take another giant step back. If we can't know sensible objects because they're constantly changing, as Heraclitus put it, you can't step in the same river twice. And that, number one, the river has changed, and number two, you've changed as well. Could you then come to know things like shadows, or images, or reflections? And I'll just cluster each of the three here down at the bottom, whichever term you prefer: shadows, images, or reflections. Well, if I can't know this table because in some senses time marches on, it's constantly changing, then how could I come to know any shadow cast by the table? If I can't know the table itself, in that sense, the shadow cast by the table would be even less real. It would be even more ephemeral, if you will. So these two would be the objects of mere opinion. Together, these constitute the bottom half of the divided line, and we can collectively refer to them as the visible world, the world as revealed to us by the senses. But again, what Plato is saying here is that the senses don't yield knowledge. So let me be sure to cross all my T's and dot all my I's. Plato is beginning with, and here's the term, he's beginning with a rejection of empiricism. Empiricism is the epistemology, the theory of knowledge, which holds to us that knowledge comes to us via the senses, that we know things by seeing and touching and hearing. The theory of knowledge, which holds that knowledge comes to us via the senses. Let's be clear here, Plato is not an empiricist. The senses don't give us knowledge, but mere opinion. Why? The sensory world gives us only change. You don't get something permanent, something which endures, out of sense data. You get constant change. Therefore, only opinion. Now, in a separate video, we'll discuss the top half of the divided line, where we leave the changing world of the senses behind and come to understand a more permanent world. We're going to make this ascent towards wisdom. It moves up the way that I've laid this out. Down here, we are all young, innocent neophytes. We think we know, but we only have opinion. We need to remove ourselves from the changing world of the senses and come to grasp a higher plane of reality. Not with the eyes or the ears, but with the mind. Here we reject empiricism. Up here, long way to go still. We're going to endorse Plato's rationalism. Plato is not an empiricist, but a rationalist. Knowledge comes to us not via the senses, but via the intellect, via reason. That'll again be covered in a separate video. Down here, we're wiping the slate clean before we can open ourselves up to this higher existence. To be continued, hang in there. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But again, let me encourage you to check out the text, roughly 28 through 50. There are a bunch of videos in this week's module that might help as well.